Welcome to the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. Today we're taking a look at John Murawski's latest investigation called In Weird Austin, a Double Shot of Academic Counter-Revolution. A new front in America's education wars is emerging in an unexpected place, Austin, Texas. Known for its progressive culture, the city is now home to two major experiments in academic reform, both pushing back against the dominant trends in higher education. At the University of Texas, the publicly funded School of Civic Leadership is launching a new civics honors major. Meanwhile, just across town, the privately funded University of Austin, or UATX, is aiming to build an entirely new institution from the ground up, one dedicated to what it calls forbidden courses and the open exchange of ideas. Now, both initiatives are part of a growing movement to create alternatives to what their backers call intellectual dead ends of modern academia, criticizing the focus on DEI, social justice activism, hyper-specialization, and narrow career training. Instead, these programs emphasize the great books, Western civilization, free markets, and individual liberty. Supporters say that they're reviving the classical liberal arts movement while drawing from colleges like Hillsdale, St. John's, and Deep Springs. Critics argue that these programs are politically motivated projects designed to promote a conservative worldview under the guise of classical education. UATX has already raised over $200 million, backed by prominent donors. But its leaders know the real test is still ahead, attracting top students, producing serious scholarships, and proving that they can offer a lasting alternative to a traditional university model. In a city better known for its progressive culture, Austin is emerging as an unexpected testing ground for these alternative approaches to higher ed. As these institutions grow, their success or failure will offer important insights into the future of civic education, intellectual diversity, and academic innovation in the United States. We're joined now by the lead investigator on the story, John Murawski. John, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
So, given that schools like Hillsdale are already accredited and promote similar values, why do you think that initiatives like UATX and the SCL are still generating such strong reactions?
Well, I would say Hillsdale is a conservative island, almost like a cocoon, and it lives in its own world. And it's not really attracting the kinds of students normally. It's not competing for the kinds of students who would normally go. I mean, maybe a little bit, but it's not really competing for the same professors and the same students that these other programs are encroaching on. So the UATX, which is the University of Austin, a small private college, which is a startup, and UT Austin School of Civic Leadership, which is also a startup. They're in their first year of classes. They're finishing up their second semester. They are hiring from universities. They're hiring from graduate schools, and they're drawing students from the regular pool of students. And their motto is, we're going to compete with you for students, and we're going to be more attractive, more compelling, more interesting, and more relevant. So their premise is that what's being taught at universities, what passes for the humanities, for poli-sci, or for social science, is deficient in some way. And it's really actually deficient in three ways. One is leftist or woke indoctrination or ideology. The other problem at universities is the problem of careerism, or what they call jobism, that you're being very narrowly trained for a specific job, which is like a professional school. And the other problem, or the other challenge for the mainstream universities, is that professors are incentivized to hyper specialize in very arcane topics. So these civics programs are not just anti-woke programs, but they're also anti-careerist and anti-jobism programs. So they're classical liberal arts, right? You might get this at the University of Chicago, for example. You could also get something like it at other universities, but it's not so concentrated. And the professors aren't hyper specializing in arcane topics. So, for example, the University of Austin, they're encouraged to be public intellectual. Professors are encouraged to be public intellectuals and have podcasts, write on Substack, and essentially engage in journalism as much as they engage in scholarship. So this is a much more full frontal attack on what the academy has become, a kind of sclerotized, bureaucratized, bloated behemoth. And these startups they profess to be quick, nimble, responsive, exciting, vibrant. So that's really why they're different from Hillsdale. Hillsdale is kind of a training corps for conservative judges, conservative government officials, and just conservatives in general. These programs, these civics programs, aren't really training grounds for conservatives. They want to draw in the liberals. They want to attract everybody.
I mean, you just mentioned that the organizers of these universities, colleges, they mention that fostering conservative thought in dialogue with liberal thought is their goal. So, from your reporting, do you think that these programs are succeeding in creating that kind of intellectual exchange?
Yeah. So that comment about what you just said, like fostering conservative thought within the broader academy. That was the impression of a professor, I believe, who sat on a committee that hired the dean for the UT Austin's School of Civic Leadership. That dean, by the way, has described himself as being straight out of an evangelical, straight out of central casting, who believes in the American exceptionalism. So he is the true conservative. Yes, they do interact because they have, for example, first of all, they draw students. Any kind of student can take these classes. You can major in it, or you can just take a class. And the classes are interesting, and they have interesting topics. So lots of students will be drawn to these classes, and lots of students are looking for something other than being told that the United States is essentially a site of human rights abuses, and Eurocentrism and Western European expansion is the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the human race. So they're looking for something, a different perspective, or some kind of alternative to what is very common in academia. I'm not sure it's common in every class, but it's common enough that if you go to academia and study the humanities and social sciences, you're going to encounter this view. So, and it's difficult to challenge that kind of hostile or a prosecutorial view towards the Western civilization. It's difficult to challenge it with, I think forcefully, without meeting some resistance from the academy. I mean, the fashionable thing to do is to be anti-American and anti-West, and to some degree anti-male and anti-white, and anti-Christian and anti-straight. I know it's a cliche, but that's not, it's not not too much of an exaggeration. So the other question would then be, are they really engaged? The other thing that they do is they bring in speakers. They have speaker series, which kind of function like debates. And so they're bringing in speakers, and they do bring in, they had one of these schools, for example, they do bring in really liberal speakers to talk with conservatives. So, for example, one of these schools, forgot which one it was, brought in Cornel West of Harvard, who is a Black professor at Harvard. I think he taught a rap class on rap. But he's also a person who's very much committed to this classical liberal tradition, even though he is has a kind of Afrocentric aspect to his I guess to his teaching or to his lecturing. He's still very much anchored in the Western tradition. And one of his favorites, one of his favorite writers is Chekhov. So we're talking about Cornel West. One of his favorite writers is Chekhov. So it's not like, if you were to listen to Ibram X. Kendi, all his favorite writers, musicians, and artists would all be people with a brown complexion, right? So it's all based on identity. Whereas for the classical liberals, it's sort of based on the content of the literature, not necessarily the identity of the speaker. Does that make sense?
It does. So reading classical text and engaging deeply with foundational ideas sounds like a strong academic model. Some might say that, they're trying to shift the pendulum back from where they think higher education has progressed to over time. What do you see are the greatest strengths and the possible limitations to this approach?
I would say that the greatest strengths of it is that it's worked for hundreds of years. So it's a time-tested approach, and it's been road tested and field tested at hundreds of universities, and it generally has worked. Now, where it began falling apart is with the rise of the Frankfurt School in the 20s in Germany, and the rise of the New Left in the 60s, with a very forceful critique of the West. And basically, after World War I and after World War II and after the Holocaust, the entire West experienced a massive crisis of confidence, essentially a loss of confidence, in that it started believing the narrative that it was nothing but a colossal lie, that had been nothing, that it was largely a project of exploitation, domination that resulted in Nazi Germany, in colonization and the extermination of entire populations and gulags and concentration camps. And so this massive crisis of confidence is what the Western tradition has not actually met. It has not actually confronted it in a way that has been intellectually satisfying to universally. So this is why creates this void for the critics to come in as critics of Western civilization, and they basically claim that they stand outside of the West. They're no longer part of the West, and they're allied with Palestine and people of color and people of oppression. So they're standing outside of those who have created the civilization. So I think the big challenge is, can these programs do something more than just revive education as it existed in 1955? Because in a sense, if you went to Hillsdale, you would get the kind of classical liberal education you might get in 1955. But what do you do with all this knowledge that has accumulated since then, over 75 years? And this would be the deconstructionists and the postmodernists and the post-structuralists and the critical theorists and the radical feminists and the queer theorists and the transhumanists and all these strains of knowledge that have just proliferated, that don't accept the basic foundations of Western civilization, which is reason, logic, empiricism. And so how do you incorporate all that? How do you deal with all that? How do you make that part? Is that part of the Western tradition? And if it is, how do you incorporate it? And if it's not, if it's just something else, what is the Western tradition since 1955, other than a reaction against it? So I think, but that's an intellectual problem for intellectuals and writers. I think for the students, the undergraduates are getting it's still a general overview. So for them, it's not such a big problem. They can still learn, even if they're not reading what's been written in the last 50 years, they're reading so much. They have very heavy reading loads in these classes, and it's very heavy on debate. It's a Socratic method of debate, small classes, debate. It's not large. It's not a large lecture series. It's not a lecture presentation. So for the students, it's much less of an issue, unless you're a student that's come from a private university or a very progressive high school, a private high school or a very progressive high school, where you're introduced to critical theories and social justice activism. Because what we mean by critical theories is social justice activism. And then you feel like, hey, I've learned a whole bunch from my teachers in high school, and I feel like I'm going back in time into a time warp, and they're not addressing these issues. So you may get students like that from time to time. I think that's kind of like, what happens to this tradition? Is it a viable tradition, or is it more like an antiquarian attempt to revive the past? That question sort of will have to be answered over time.
So as we wrap things up, what do you want to leave people with what you picked up from your investigation?
I think the main thing is that the stories that you're getting, this is a kind of a self-serving or self-aggrandizing comment, but the stories you're getting in the mainstream media about civics are very propagandistic. They're very much aligned with ideological professors who are hostile to classical liberal education. And they want to replace it with a relentless critique of systems of power, with a focus on intersectional identities, with a focus on oppression, microaggressions, and social justice. And so they're professors who are invested in that kind of scholarship, and they're hostile to a traditional type of scholarship. So what the media, the sort of media reports come from a very hostile perspective, a very, like I would say, a radically skeptical perspective on these programs. If you look at the syllabi for the classes, and if you sit in on a class, it's nothing like what's described in these articles. These are not right-wing indoctrination classes. These are more like classical liberal, humanistic classes that you would have taken any time from like 1948 to 1968. So that was like the golden age. That's when American universities, I don't know, doubled or tripled or quadrupled in size from federal funding. And that's when we created the modern American middle class after World War II. And there weren't that many majors that were available back then. And English and history and humanities were a hugely popular major. And that was the basis of the education for an entire generation of people in America. So that's the kind of education you would get. And it's very different from what you would read about in articles. And it's much more interesting and fun than than you would see in these papers. So that's really I think the takeaway from this. These are not propaganda mills. These are legitimate academic techniques, but their golden age was from, I would say 1948 to 1968. That was the golden age of this kind of humanistic approach, or maybe the 20th century was. And so they're trying to revive something. The question is, can they revive it, and can they make it viable, or are they going to be? Is it going to be more hard and more difficult and more challenging? Or will the donors get bored of it after a while? Or will they be able to attract students? How much can they expand? How many classes can they have? So before students get bored, eventually things, they're phases and their pendulums swing this way and that. And right now this is in vogue, and it's exciting and it has a lot of energy. But how long can they keep it going? That's going to be a challenge for them. Some of these programs will survive. I don't have any doubt. Some they have. Like the one in the University of Florida's Hamilton Center has really top-notch scholars, and all these programs hire from good universities, and they hire real professors. So they will be able to. Some of them, I think, will thrive and survive, and some of them, will become more mediocre. But that's more like with any department. You have mediocre history departments and like world-class history departments. So you have something like that in civics too.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much.
That was it for the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'll see you next time.